on the various policy options. Let me start with just a point on terminology. Because I'm so new to the debate, I guess the terms climate change and price volatility caused me a bit of discomfort, and I want to just go into that for a moment, even though I doubt whether other people share it, because it does lead into a point. Climate change to me suggests a long-term structural change in the state of affairs, whereas price volatility is all about variability and fluctuations. But it seems to me that both those long-term aspects and the short-term aspects are both common to climate change and to price change over time. I think when you listen to the people that are expert on climate change, they are, in the main, are talking about the long-term structural things, but they're also talking about an increase in the frequency of extreme events, which is going to give you greater variability as well. So there are these two dimensions, and likewise with price changes. There seems to be underway, after a century, more or less, of long-term decline in prices for many food commodities. There now seems to be a turning point in that trend, and many people believe this is going to be an ongoing thing for a whole variety of reasons. At the same time, there is concerns being expressed about the volatility of those prices and the fact that they sometimes are fluctuating very wildly and have done so recently. So both of those things have long-term consequences as well as short-term consequences, and that's something that I didn't really get too much of a sense of in the discussion today. I think the organisers of this workshop had that very firmly in mind because they had both bases covered. The second session, most of the talks there were focusing on the long-term structural changes, and the modelling work done by IFPRI is very much a case in point, whereas the third session was focusing on how you recover from emergencies, and that seemed to me focusing very much on what was involved in coping with these short-term sudden fluctuations. Even though they might be temporary and transient, they cause real hardship in the short term and also needed to be addressed. Now the question of what happens to prices is not, it seems to me, important in its own right, but it is important as a sign of what's happening and as a transmission mechanism. But in terms of food security, there are many countries now around the world that have coped with increasing food prices because the rate of growth of incomes has been greater than the rate of change in prices, and so food security has diminished food security has increased over time, insecurity has diminished over time, and I think we need to keep track of that larger picture in terms of whether these prices are a cause for concern. The other interesting thing that I picked up here was the changes in the balance between those that benefit from an increase in prices, food prices, and those that lose. This morning we heard that the estimate is in Indonesia that by 2025 something like 75% of the population will be an urban population and only 25% will be a rural population. And what's more, of the 25%, only 70%, not only, but 70% are net consumers of rice, and so that means that only 30% are net producers of rice, and 30% of 25% is starting to get quite a small number. So the numbers that are going to gain from food price increases is getting smaller and smaller relative to the numbers that lose from it, and of course vice versa for price falls. The reason why I think it's important to highlight the two sides or the two dimensions to all three of these issues, climate change, price change and food security, is that the sort of policies that you need to address the long-term issues might be different to the types of policy that you need to address the short-term issues. When I did Economics Policy 101 some 40 odd years ago, we were taught then anyhow that you needed different policy instruments to achieve different policy objectives, and on the assumption that that's still the received wisdom, it seems to me that if we're going to make progress on both fronts, we need to be focusing and have a clear view of the two different dimensions of these problems. Another observation I'd like to make is that price volatility in particular, and even climate change, would not be of a lot of concern if we could costly adapt to them. Today we've heard, however, that the likely costs of adaptation and mitigation are very costly indeed, and therefore that we need to think seriously about it. But there is a temporal dimension to this issue that we need to think about. There's still considerable uncertainty about the ultimate consequences of climate change, and in particular on the impact on its impact on the degree and distribution of food security. So as the rebuilding after an emergency goes, the traditional instruments for humanitarian relief, followed by rehabilitation and construction, will always be an important part of the story. However, there are policies that could be put in place to reduce the social cost of these measures, and possibly that's one area where there's a research gap that could be addressed. With regards to the long-term structural effects of the process of climate change, another possible research gap is the analysis of the optimal timing to implement adaptation measures. Do it too soon, and there's a significant risk of investment in adaptation measures that prove unnecessary or at least suboptimal. Do it too late, and avoidable costs will be incurred. So there needs to be some sort of balance here, and economists are generally pretty good at solving these problems of trading off over time costs that are diminishing and costs that are growing to find optimal timing issues. And it seems to me that that's an area where the economics profession could make some very useful contributions to some of the questions in this area, and may well have done so, I add. That might reflect simply my ignorance of the literature rather than, but if it hasn't been done, it does seem to me to be a fertile area for economic research. Lastly, I want to turn to a message that came through fairly clearly to me today from a number of the presentations, and that is that sound economic policies, including but not limited to trade liberalisation policies, can and should play an important role in offsetting and building resilience to both short-term and long-term dimensions of food security arising from climate change and price volatility. Now that's not to say there aren't some changes, but it does seem to me that overall the big questions in development remain, and the big challenges are in many respects the same, although there's going to be some shift in emphasis. We've heard how water's become more important, and so some shift within the overall economic development to the importance of water is one thing that I got a message about today. Another one in terms of the fluctuations from price spikes is risk management. Maybe we need more emphasis in our research programs on risk management. Nevertheless, it's crucially important, I think, to continue to carry out sound policy-oriented research on economic development and growth together with poverty alleviation to achieve growth with equity and domain social stability. And that's a huge challenge, and one that I'm sure IFPRI and other organisations here will continue to make important contributions to. Thank you.